Okay, welcome to our fifth video about Charles Dickens' novel A Christmas Carol. Today we are going to be looking at the appearance of Marley's ghost. So again, I'm going to be talking to you about some of the major themes of the novel and then also just talking you through some of the language here because it's a really important scene that you understand very clearly. So again, just reading through each section at a time and then stopping to discuss some of the key symbolism and key quotations within this part of the text. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the two buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular, for a shade." He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. Okay, so a few things just to pick out in the first instance about the ghost's appearance and how Scrooge reacts to it. So the first thing that is really important to notice is this chain that the ghost wears around his body. So this chain is made up of all of these symbols that represent business and trade: cash boxes, keys, padlocks, all of these things representing Marley's life working in business and the obsession with money that he shares with Scrooge. So Dickens uses the images of cash boxes and ledgers, keys, padlocks, etc. to represent the obsession with money that Marley and Scrooge share. In the afterlife, Marley carries these physical representations of his sins. So these things literally represent the sins of his life, and his major sin is greed. However, given that we know that Marley was at least a little bit generous during his life, remember the charity workers referring to him as having this sense of liberality that Scrooge worries what they want from him. This hints that Scrooge's own punishment that's waiting for him in the afterlife is going to be weighty indeed. So if this chain is made up of Marley's sins, and we know that Marley was more generous than Scrooge, Scrooge's own chain is going to be much heavier and much more serious. Okay, not only that, but Scrooge doesn't believe in what he is seeing. Despite this ghost appearing before his own eyes, he doesn't believe in what he is seeing. And his rational side is again brought out here as he rejects the evidence that's been presented in front of him. So, though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, he was still incredulous, meaning he was disbelieving. When he looks at its death-cold eyes, he feels their chilling influence. So we can see that Dickens presents this ghost as disturbing and frightening. And again, think about that imagery of coldness. Coldness now which is used to associate the ghost and death, whereas previously in the novel coldness is related to this lack of generosity. All these images being linked together. Scrooge is immediately suspicious of the ghost. He's cold and hostile, even though it appears to him in the appearance of his old friend, Jacob Marley. He suspects that it wants something from him. So just as he was suspicious of the charity workers, just as he seems somewhat suspicious even of his own nephew Fred, he's suspicious now of Marley, despite the positive, or at least the good business relationship that they had when Marley was alive. This word here, shade, literally just means ghost. So you are particular for a shade, you're very specific for a ghost. So Marley's ghost sits down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if it were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blob of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit staring at those fixed, glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapour from an oven. Okay, so this is really interesting. The ghost asks Scrooge, "Why do you doubt your senses?" And Scrooge makes this joke that possibly the ghost is just sort of a figment of the imagination brought on by a stomach complaint. So he makes this joke at the ghost's expense. But really, this is telling us something a little bit more about Scrooge. Scrooge doesn't pay attention to his senses during his everyday life. He seems completely indifferent to the freezing cold of his office, even of his own room here, where he has such a low fire that he has to sit with it for ages before he warms up. But not only that, he's indifferent to the suffering of others, which he should see all around him. Sitting right next to him in his own office is Bob Cratchit, who is poor and freezing cold and doesn't have a proper coat but just has this white comforter that he wraps around him. But the only thing that Scrooge has faith in is money. He pays no attention to his own senses and what they should show him because he is so cut off from the world, because he is obsessed with the accumulation of wealth. Scrooge's reaction, this joking remark that he makes about the ghost being sort of produced by indigestion, Dickens says he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention. So he uses humour, he turns to humour in order to try and distract himself from his growing fear. So he tries to brush the ghost off as nothing by making this joking remark because it is beginning to frighten him. The spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones, so it chills him through and through. Dickens returns again to this idea of fixed glazed eyes. So, despite his joking remarks to the ghost, there's this judgmental stare that the ghost is giving him, and Scrooge seems completely unnerved by this. Look at that wonderful fixed glazed eyes. Fixed, suggesting that they continue staring unblinkingly, unforgivingly at Scrooge, but glazed as well, suggesting that there's no humanity in that stare. The sight of the ghost, we might infer, pricks at his conscience. It reminds him of his own sins. Okay, not only that, but it seems to have an infernal atmosphere of its own. Its hair and skirts and tassels move as if by the hot vapour from an oven. And just think about that, perhaps as hellish imagery, this infernal atmosphere, suggesting perhaps that Marley, because of his sins, is closer to hell than to heaven. "You see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. "Well, you are not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, notwithstanding. "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug." Remember, humbug means nonsense. So Scrooge again is joking. If he were to eat that toothpick, he'd have such a bad stomach that he would be pursued by all kinds of figments of his imagination, much like, he argues, the ghost is. At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy!" he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain, and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Okay, so first of all, the ghost takes on a suddenly dramatically more frightful and disturbing appearance when it raised a frightful cry. Scrooge is so afraid he holds tight onto his chair to stop himself from fainting, and then when the ghost takes off its bandage, its kind of decaying jaw collapses on its chest. Think about the fact that this clanking chain that the ghost is shaking makes the ghost resemble a sort of exaggerated form of a Victorian prisoner. He looks like he is in chains, in shackles, like one who is in jail. And this again hints at that idea of punishment and retribution. There has to be some payment for the sins of one's life. And this, Dickens suggests, will be coming to Scrooge all too soon. So Scrooge finds himself harder pressed to ignore the ghost that's in front of him when it's shaking these chains, when it's so loud, so frightening and so disturbing. The ghost explains that every spirit within every man is doomed to wander through the world. So this is the punishment that Marley suffers. After death, he's doomed to wander the world and witness what it cannot share. So it's these things that it cannot take part in, but it could have shared on earth. So it's doomed to think about all of the things that it didn't do in life. Scrooge says you are fettered, meaning you are chained, and asks why. And the ghost finally explains what this chain is. Dickens makes the symbolism really clear. They represent Marley's sins. He said, "I made it link by link. Each little link in this chain I made by myself. Each one represents something that I did in my life." He says, "I girded it of my own free will. I made it by myself, consciously, and of my own free will I wore it. So my sins were my own. I did these things. I have doomed myself to wear this chain." He then says, "Is its pattern strange to you? Does the look of it seem unfamiliar to you?" So the ghost is hinting that Scrooge should recognise this chain and the way that it's made, because he has the same sins himself. Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was as full and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You've laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly, "old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting-house. Mark me! In life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me." Okay, so the ghost, seeing Scrooge's fear, asks him, "Do you know how long and how heavy the chain that you have made for yourself is?" He explains it was as long as his is now, 7 years ago, and Scrooge has done more to work on it since. So we get the sense that Scrooge's sins far outweigh Marley's. They were equivalent to Marley's 7 years ago when Marley died, but Scrooge has continued down this path of sin and greed and cruelty for 7 years more. And so because of that, he is doomed to an even worse fate than Marley. He's going to have to carry an even heavier chain in the afterlife. Scrooge's reaction here is interesting. He speaks to Marley using his forename, Jacob. "Old Jacob Marley, Rather than calling him shade or ghost, he tries to treat him as a friend, and you sort of see his desperation and his pleading and his bargaining here, which are growing because of his fear of what the ghost is saying. Marley's ghost continues to explain, "My spirit never walked beyond our counting house." He says, "Mark me, pay attention to me, listen to this." Because Marley spent his entire life in that office, in that counting house, in the afterlife he has to walk far and wide carrying this chain, and a far worse fate seems to await Scrooge. Look at what he says, "I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere." So this life he has after death seems to be one marked by a lack of freedom. He's just condemned to walk endlessly. Okay, moving on. It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. "You must have been very slow about it, Jacob," Scrooge observed in a business-like manner, though with humility and deference. "Slow?" the ghost repeated. 7 years dead," mused Scrooge, "and travelling all the time." "The whole time," said the ghost, "no rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse." "You travel fast?" said Scrooge. "On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost. "Well, you might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years," said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry, and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. "Oh, captive bound and double-ironed!" cried the phantom, "not to know that ages of incessant labour by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I." "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business!" cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." It held up its chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all of its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. "At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. Okay, so we learn a little bit more of the ghost's fate. Scrooge making jokes about how slowly the ghost must have travelled to only get as far as their counting house in 7 years frustrate the ghost. He refers to no rest, no peace, and the incessant torture of remorse, the incessant torture of regret. His afterlife is presented, therefore, as this sort of endless torment of walking. He is captive, bound, and double-ironed, so he is like a prisoner. He explains, or attempts to explain to Scrooge, that life is short, but regrets are long and haunting. He implies that a life has potential for a vast means of usefulness, but may be misused. So there is much that we can do in our lives while we're on earth to help others, much good that we can do. But it's clear that Scrooge is misusing his life in isolation and in pursuing money at all costs. So you can see here the ghost feels this regret, not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunity misused. Scrooge doesn't understand this straight away and says, "You were always a good man of business." So he doesn't really understand Marley's punishment or why it's happening. Dickens uses that phrase, "good man of business," to illustrate Scrooge's lack of understanding, his lack of comprehension. He doesn't understand that actually business, the pursuit of money, is why Marley is suffering so much now. So Dickens starts to portray really Scrooge's realisation that Marley's story relates to his own life when he says Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. He's thinking to himself, well, Marley was a good man of business, I am a good man of business. Why is he damned in this way? The ghost goes on to explain a little more. He says, mankind was my business, the common welfare was my business. So the ghost here is advocating, it's arguing for social responsibility, looking after your fellow man, being responsible for those people around you, not just for yourself. He states that common welfare, that is, the well-being of all people, should have been his business in life, along with charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence, meaning kindness. He says all of those things were my business, all of those things were things I should have been involved in. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. So all of these things he ignored in favour of his trade, that is his job, and we see that Scrooge has rejected all of these virtues like charity and mercy. He rejected all of those for pursuing money. Of course, we know Scrooge has done the same. Okay. Scrooge began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me," cried the ghost, "my time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray." "How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see I may not tell?" the ghost says. "I've sat invisible beside you many and many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. "That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer." "You were always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "Thank ye." "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits. So we see that the ghost has been sitting next to Scrooge day after day, but this is the first time that he's been able to appear to him. So this really shows us that the ghost has been a witness to Scrooge's many sins. It's something of a Christmas miracle then in the way that this is presented, that he is now visible to Scrooge and can interact with him, because ordinarily he is invisible to human sight. The ghost explains, "I'm here tonight to warn you have a chance of escaping my fate." So Dickens finally makes the purpose of this appearance very clear. Scrooge has a chance to make things better. And the ghost explains he's going to be visited by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering tone. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. "Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge. "Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us." So Scrooge is frightened by the prospect of being visited by these 3 ghosts. We start to wonder whether perhaps he fears their judgment, he fears what it is that they're going to have to say to him. But Marley makes it very clear that if he ignores the ghosts, he will be doomed to follow the same path as him. Dickens here creates a really clear structure for the next few chapters of his novel. Scrooge is going to be visited by 3 ghosts on 3 subsequent nights, so we have very clearly set out for us as readers the next stages of his journey. When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible, he became aware, of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. Just to stop for a moment and talk about some of this language, Dickens uses some really powerful vocabulary here, some really powerful words to describe the sounds that can be heard. Incoherent sounds of lamentation, meaning grief and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful, and self-accusatory. So these are the sounds of these spirits blaming themselves for their lack of action in life, lamenting, being filled with sorrow and regret. So the spectre listens for a while, then joins in the mournful dirge. So it has almost a funereal sound to it. It's a desperately sad song being sung, these noises that the spirits are making. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere, for good, in human matters, and had lost the power forever. So, this is a really powerful image that Dickens creates here of these lost souls who didn't help those in need during their own lives and now are unable to do so. So, in particular, he uses this image of this old ghost in a white waistcoat who sees a poor woman sitting on a doorstep with a baby and cries piteously at seeing this woman and being unable to help her. It's struck with misery and despair. And the vision here seems really clear. If Scrooge does not listen to what the three spirits tell him, he's going to become one of these spirits himself. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell, but they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say "humbug," but stopped at the first syllable, and being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or the glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation with the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. Okay, I hope that that's been helpful to you. I hope that that's clarified some of the things that the ghost talks to Scrooge about, and we will continue in our next video with Stave 2. Thanks for listening. Good luck with your revision.